Hi friends, this is Trilochan from Ceylon Software Bhubaneswar. In this video, I will explain one of the beautiful concept in Java multithreading, that is Java deadlock. So I will give the clarity by taking an example. So what exactly the concept behind deadlock? Suppose let we have two threads. So let we have two threads. Let T1 is a thread and T2 is another thread. Suppose, as we know, a thread representing a task. Suppose my first thread T1, my second thread T2. Let Similarly, we have two resources. Let we have two resources. Let R1 and R2. Let we have two resources R1 and R2. Okay, so we have two threads T1 and T2. Similarly, we have two resources R1 and R2. Now, suppose let we have a scenario T1 have acquired R1 and trying to access R2 for completing its execution. T1 have acquired R1 and trying to access R2 for completing its execution. Similarly, T2 have acquired R2 and trying to access R1 for completing its execution. Then the question will arise how T1 and T2 will execute completely. If T1 will execute completely, then T2 will compromise if suppose T2 will release R2 to T1, then T1 will take R2, then T1 will start its execution by taking R1 and R2 and it will complete its execution. Otherwise, T1 will release R1 if to T2, then by taking R1, T2, then T2 will complete its execution by taking R1 and R2. So if it will or this scenario will arise, then T1 will execute completely, then T2 will execute completely. But here T1 never release R1 to T2, T2 never release R2 to T1. So as a result, T1 and T2 never execute completely. So that situation is called as a deadlock. So deadlock is a situation where no thread execute completely. Here T1 have acquired, T1 is able to acquire R1 and trying to acquire R2, but R2 T2 have acquired. Same way T2 is able to acquire R2 and trying to acquire R1 for completing its execution. So in this scenario, T1 and T2, so T1 never release R1 to T2 or T2 never release R2 to T1. So as a result, T1 and T2 never execute completely. So this situation is called as deadlock. Suppose I will give the clarity by taking an example. Suppose let class, now I will represent the concept of deadlock in the form of a Java program. Okay, so whatever we observed, whatever we got the point, deadlock is a situation where no thread execute completely. Suppose class name, let class name is deadlock example. Let public static void main string args. So now I have to take to a resource. So internally operating system, whatever allocating resources for executing any task, so that is completely abstract. So but we know, so one resource, so that is coming in our picture, that is object, and we have known every string value is an object, or every strings are object, so I can treat as a resource. So that's why I will take two string value. Let string, suppose r1 equals to let java. Similarly I will take string r2 equals to let, I will take another string value, let res. Let we have two resources. Let r1 is my one resource and r2 is my another resource. Now I will create two threads as per my analysis. So I will define a thread. So now I will create, I will define a thread fully. Then so we know that there is a built-in class, there is named as thread class. There is a built-in class named as thread class. Thread t1 equals to new thread. Okay, now t1 is my one thread. I will take two thread t1 and t2. Let, so there are varieties of ways that we can create a thread. So here I have presented t1 as a thread. So in this way, now, so as per my definition, t1 is able to synchronize. T1 is able to lock R1. So we have two resources, R1 and R2. Then as we know, in multi-threading context, to fully define a thread, it is mandatory that we have to define a method, that is run method. Without run method, a thread, we cannot say it is fully defined. So public void run. So run method is a built-in method. Run method definition representing our task. So to fully define a thread, now T1 is our thread, one thread. To fully define our thread, we have to define a run method. So what is my task? My task is, so T1 will try to synchronize R1, or T1 will try to lock R1. Okay, so how it is a block synchronization? So synchronize, just to see, and within bracket I can write R1. So this is block synchronization, a specific resource. I want to synchronize. So synchronized is a keyword. So synchronized within bracket R1, that means T1 trying to synchronize R1. That means T1 trying to lock R1. Okay, suppose one statement I will write. Suppose system.out.println, so I can write, so in T1 in T1, suppose let R1 locked. Suppose one statement, suppose I wrote. Okay, so now T1 is trying to lock R1. T1 is trying to synchronize R1. Then suppose one scenario that we have after 1000 millisecond, then T1 will try to synchronize R2. So if it will be my scenario, then I have to invoke, I have to call a sleep method, because my question again I'm repeating what is my purpose. Suppose T1 is trying to lock R1 after 1000 millisecond, T1 will try to synchronize or lock R2. So after 1000 millisecond, so for that I will call sleep method. So sleep method is a static method that is directly invoking by a class, that is thread class, and this is a such method, I mean sleep method, which is what by default throwing an exception. So when sleep method I will call that, I have to write within try block and catch block, try block and catch block. So I can write thread dot sleep method within bracket. I will write 1000. That means 1000 millisecond. So once I will specify try block, so definitely I have to specify catch block. So whatever the exception will arise, so it may, if exception may arise, so it will be handled. So without try block, a catch is meaningless. Without catch, try is meaningless. So you remember here one point, sleep method is a static method. It is directly invoking by thread class. And sleep method is a such method, by default it is throwing checked exception. So that's why when anywhere we will call sleep method, we have to write within a try block. Then the concept or whatever our scenario, after 1000 millisecond, now T1 will try to synchronize R2. T1 will try to synchronize. So synchronized R2. R2. Let we will write system.out.println, system.out.println. So I can write in T1, in T1 R2 locked, R2 locked. Okay, so this is, I ended curly bracket. Now I ended curly bracket. Run method ended, again I ended a curly bracket, then last curly bracket and semicolon. So guys, one important point to remember, if you are creating a thread by using thread class, or you are defining a thread by using in this way, thread T1 equals to new thread, so curly bracket begin and curly bracket end, after that you have to put a semicolon. This is the general form. So here what I have done, so here T1, if I will so write the, or one, if I will specify the comment, thread T1 trying to lock R1, then after 1000 millisecond trying to lock R2. Okay, so this is one thread. Simply similarly I will define another thread. Let the thread is T2, and what will be my scenario? T2 will try to lock R2, then after 1000 millisecond T2 will try to lock R1. So simply, so this portion I will copy and simply I will paste. So what I will change, what I will change simply. So so thread T2, T2, then T2 is trying to lock R2. So I can write in T2 R2 locked. Then after 1000 millisecond, T2 is trying to lock R1. Right. So in this way, we define T1 thread, and here T1 is trying to lock R1 after 1000 millisecond, trying to lock R2. Similarly, in case of T2, so what I have done, so thread T2 trying to lock R2, then after 1000 millisecond trying to lock R1. Okay, thread T2 to fully define a thread, I have defined run method. So in that way, I presented. Now, so we know that how to start a thread. So we have two threads. One is T1 and one is T2. T1 dot start method, then T2 dot start method. Okay, so now I will end the main method, I will end the class. So as we know, when start is a built-in method. When it is invoking by the thread instance, a thread will execute. So when this line will execute, so this person will execute, and when this line will execute, then this person will execute. So we will see. So what we were getting the output. So now this is my deadlock example program. So now I will save. My class name is deadlock example. So my program name is deadlock example dot java. Now I will do all files. I will save. Then I will go to command prompt. Okay, so now I will compile and I will run. So I will go to A drive, I will go to Java program folder. So here I have saved my program deadlock example.java. Now I will compile Java C space file name deadlock example.java. Now I will run. So there is no compilation error. So successfully deadlock example.java compiled. Now I will run Java space class name deadlock example just to see. So what we are getting the output. Now I will hit enter. So you see output is incomplete. In T1 R1 logged, in T2 R2 logged. So from the output we can do the analysis. In T1 R1 logged, in T1 R1 logged, this statement have executed, but in T2 R2 logged, this have not come to the picture. That means T1 is not able to acquire, T1 is not able to synchronize, T1 is not able to log R2. So from this output that we got the point, and from this output in T2 R2 locked. That means in T2 R2 locked, this output, this statement have executed. So that means T2 is able to acquire R2, but T2 is not able to acquire R1. So we can say T1 and T2 have not executed completely. Only T1 have acquired R1 and T2 have acquired R2. Okay, so this is the concept of a deadlock, and this situation is the concept of a deadlock. So what is deadlock? Deadlock is a situation where no thread execute completely. Okay, so I hope everybody got clarity. So this is one of the interview question and very beautiful point in Java multi-threading chapter, especially in thread synchronization. I hope you enjoy with this video. Thank you.